Hey, we're in part 2 of this series, What Happy Couples Know, and to recap where we were last time, all of us come into relationships or dream of relationships or imagine relationships with things in mind that we want to be true of those relationships. We move toward engagement with those things. We move toward the altar with those things. And essentially, we said last week, it's essentially like we all have a box of hopes and dreams and desires. And even if you're single and not dating anybody right now, you could sit down and sort of script out in general terms, hey, if I'm ever in a relationship, if I'm ever married, here's what I'd like it to look like relationally. Now, the problem is, or the challenge, it's not even a problem, it's just the challenge. The challenge is this: when we daydream about the future, our future, as we daydream and as we imagine, it organizes itself around our box. It organizes itself around our hopes, wishes, dreams, and desires. To put it way, when I was single, I never daydreamed about becoming the perfect person for someone. I daydreamed about finding the perfect person for me. Is that just me? I never daydreamed about, I can't wait until I become the perfect person for someone. I daydreamed about the perfect person for me. So when I met Sandra, I thought, well, she's perfect for me. So I brought her ring and my box to the altar. I brought her ring and my box to the wedding. And the thing is, everything in my box seems perfectly reasonable to me. Why wouldn't everybody not want to center their lives around what's in my box? And she brought her box to the altar and to the wedding as well. And everything in her box seemed perfectly reasonable to her. But the problem is, when we hand our box of hopes, dreams, and desires to somebody else, the density changes and the weight changes, and what begins and feels to us like a hope or a dream or a desire feels to them like an expectation. And the interesting thing is this: on this side of the box, it's all hopes, dreams, and desires. On that side of the box, it's all expectations. I'm like, well, why wouldn't everybody want to order their life this way? And the person on the other side of the box is going, because that just feels like a lot of expectations to me. From where I'm standing, hopes, dreams, and desires. From where you're sitting, from where she's standing, all about the expectations. An expectation, as you know, or if you don't know, here's the definition. It's a strong belief that something will happen or be the case in the future. It's the strong belief that something will happen. Honey, I know we're not there yet, but we're moving in that direction, aren't we, honey? Dear, I know this is the first year, but eventually, right, honey? It's that subtle pressure that things are going to be the way I imagine they're going to be. They're going to be the way that you imagine they're going to be. It's subtle. It's all about the future. And here's the thing. Anytime we attempt to recreate or avoid something from the past, anytime we attempt in a relationship to recreate or avoid something from the past, our hopes and dreams and our desires begin to feel like expectations, because we want to create a preferred future. It may be a preferred future that's exactly like the past that we grew up in. We want to recreate it. Or it may be a preferred future that's very different than the family that we grew up in. But either way, as soon as we try to shape the future of a relationship, it begins to feel like expectations to the person that we're in relationship with. And when couples exchange boxes, and we do, this just happens. I don't know that it can be completely avoided, but when we exchange boxes, couples begin negotiating with each other, bargaining with each other, sometimes bribing each other. I will if you will. If you'll do this the way I want to do it, then we'll avoid conflict and we'll resolve conflict the way you do it. And back and forth and back and forth. And what happens is, no one ever intends for this to happen. Eventually, the relationship is characterized, as we said last week, by a debt-debtor relationship. You owe me. You owe me, you owe me. And the problem is, we said this last week, that when you get into this dynamic, when this dynamic characterizes the relationship, you cannot recognize love. You can't give love and you can't receive love because you can't appreciate it and you can't even recognize it. Now, let me illustrate it this way. You see, if you owe me money, you can't give me money, right? If you owe me money, you can't give me money. If you owe me money and you give me money, I don't see it as a gift and I don't receive it as a gift. I see it and receive it as a payment. So in a relationship that has become a debt-debtor, or the dynamic of the relationship is a debt-debtor relationship, as long as somebody feels like somebody owes them, they don't receive it as love, they can't see it as love, and the other person can't even extend love. So the question is, how do we keep this from happening? How do we keep legitimate hopes, dreams, and desires from becoming and feeling like expectations? And the answer is, we answer the following question the way that happy couples answer the following question. And the question is, what does he owe me? What does she owe me? What does he owe me? What does she owe me? And happy couples all answer this question the same way. They answer the question, nothing. They don't owe me anything. They know that they owe each other everything, but are owed nothing in return. They know that they owe each other everything, but are owed nothing in return, which, granted, doesn't make any sense. But as you get to know really, really happy couples, there's something about their relationship that doesn't make any sense. Great relationships are not built on specific codes of conduct, and they're not even built on specific roles, and a great relationship is not built on a sort of an exchange of services, of goods and services. That a great relationship really boils down to being a submission competition. That in a great relationship, in any healthy relationship, instead of there being competition, instead of there being bargaining and negotiating, there's a sense of, well, she doesn't owe me, he doesn't owe me anything. But I feel like I owe her, I owe him everything. Now today, I want to explain where I learned this and where I saw this and where we get this. And here's the story. Here's how it happened. At the end of Jesus' ministry, he's hours away from being arrested. He gathers his guys together and he says to them, here's a few things I want you to remember. And toward the end of that time, as they're sharing their last Passover together, he says this. He said, I'm going to give you a brand new command. Now, this should have been very offensive. In fact, these Jewish boys should have gotten up and left the room. And here's why. This doesn't bother us, doesn't faze us in the least. But the only person that could give a command was God. And God had given all the commands through Moses. So you can talk about the commands, you can exegete the commands, you can explain the commands, you can apply the commands, you can prioritize the commands, but you don't make up new ones. So there was a sense in which Jesus was equating himself with Moses and in a sense claiming to speak for God. And these guys should have gotten up and left the room, but the night had already been very confusing. Judas had left to run an errand. Jesus basically took their most sacred holiday and turned it into something all about himself. So the whole night is crazy. And he says, guys, I know this is crazy. I'm kind of stepping in front of Moses. I'm stepping between you and God, but I'm going to give you a new command. And here's what he said. He said, a new command I give you, love one another. To which they may have responded, that's not new. To which Jesus would have responded, I'm not through, because here's the rest of it. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Now, this is an epic moment. This is such a big moment because Jesus says, I'm reducing all the Jewish law from 600 and something to 2 to 1. That at the end of the day, these are your marching orders relationally. You are to treat other people the way I have treated you. And he could have gone around the room to each one of those guys and said, Matthew, you remember when we met? You were a tax collector. You were an embarrassment to your family. You were an embarrassment to the nation. And do you remember what I said to you when I met you, Matthew? Matthew's like, yep, I remember. You asked me to follow you. And Peter, you remember how you didn't want Matthew following us because you didn't want to be associated with the tax gatherer? And Peter's like, yep. And remember I let both of you stay in the club. And Matthew, do you remember where we went when I invited you to follow me? Yep, we went to my house. Do you remember who we invited? Peter's like, I remember who we invited. All of his tax gathering friends. It was the worst day of my life. And Jesus said, Matthew, I want you to extend that kind of grace and that kind of mercy to every single person you meet for the rest of your life. Nathaniel, you remember when we met? Oh yeah. Remember Nathaniel? You dissed my whole family. This isn't really a famous Bible story, but when Nathaniel heard about Jesus and that he was from Nazareth, his response was, Nazareth? What good thing could come from Nazareth? So Jesus could have said, remember, you dissed my family, my grandfamily, my stickball team, all of my childhood friends. You pretty much made us all sound like complete losers. Do you remember that, Nathaniel? I remember that. Nathaniel, you remember? I invited you to follow me. And I never brought it up again, did I? No, he never brought it up. He could have gone all the way around the room and said, okay, from now on, I want you to think about how I treated you. That's how I want you to treat everybody. And a few hours later, he would be arrested and he would be tried and he would be crucified. And that would be, in a few days, an aha moment from which they would never recover when they realized Jesus gave his life on our behalf and he is asking us to do the same for other people. That's why this is sometimes called the law of Christ, or I call it the platinum rule. The golden rule is treat people the way you want to be treated. The platinum rule is treat people the way that God in Christ treated you. In fact, let me kind of make it simple to remember. When you're not sure what to say or do, you just love like God through Christ loved you. That's it. When you're not sure what to say or do relationally, you go, okay, how did God through Christ treat me when I was misbehaving, when I messed up, when I, broke a promise? When you're not sure what to say or do, you love like God through Christ loved you. This is the big one. This is the marching orders. Every single New Testament imperative after the resurrection, every single New Testament imperative after the resurrection tees off and keys off of this big idea. As I've loved you, so you are to love other people. Then, a few years later, a guy named Paul, the Apostle Paul, who hated Christians, arrested Christians, tortured Christians, put Christians to death. If you hate Christians, you would love the Apostle Paul. He hated them more than you. You hate him in your mind. He hated him as a job, okay? And the Apostle Paul becomes a Jesus follower. And when he does, his life is completely transformed. And he takes this big idea of love others the way that God through Christ has loved us. He takes that big idea and he begins to apply it to all kinds of relationships. He applies it to everything, including marriage. So whenever you read anything the Apostle Paul writes in his letters that says do this or don't do that, do this or don't do that, here's what you need to remember. Every one of his commands is linked specifically and directly to Jesus' command to treat others the way that I have treated you. He's not making stuff up. He's applying Jesus' brand new command. So in his letter to the Christians living in Ephesus, the Apostle Paul applies Jesus' new command to marriage. And here's what he says. Wives, submit yourself to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. I mean, what could be any clearer than that? Let's pray. Now, if this bothers you, I'm so glad it bothers you, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm just going to leave it up here to bother you. In fact, some of you would say, aha, that's why I don't like Christians. I am so glad you are watching or listening today. I'm telling you, what you're about to hear, this is so transformational. I love talking about this. Our English Bibles are translations from Greek text, and there were groupings of Greek text all over the East. And the oldest text, the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament, the oldest manuscripts of the Apostle Paul's letters, interestingly enough, if you took this verse and you translated it literally, here's what it would say. It would say, wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord. There's no verb in this statement in the oldest Greek manuscripts. There's no verb. The word submit isn't there. Now, before I explain why it's not there, I want to explain something else, and this is so important. When the Apostle Paul's first century audience heard him teach about women submitting to their husbands, and I'll tell you where the verb came from in just a second. When the first century audience heard the Apostle Paul talk about women and wives submitting to their husbands, whereas we go, what? And huh? Their response was, duh, not huh. They weren't like, what? They were like, well, yeah, tell us something we don't know. They had no choice. I mean, this wasn't new information. This wasn't even a big deal. This was common ground. So why isn't there a verb in this verse? And the answer is the verb comes from the verse before. And this was a typical kind of Greek grammatical way of doing things. That you make a statement with a verb, and then in the next statement, you just infer the verb. You don't include it. You just take your verb from what came before. That submit, the verb submit, is actually inferred from the verse that came before. So we should ask, what was the verse that came before that gives us the verb for this verse? And my friends, you're looking up here, this is a game changer. Here's what Paul said before he told wives submit to their husbands. Here's the verse that sets the tone for everything that follows. Here's our verb. Submit to one another out of, and there it is again. Every time the Apostle Paul tells us to do something, he points us back to Jesus. Not the Old Testament, not the 10 Commandments, Jesus. As God through Christ has done something extraordinary for you, you are to demonstrate that same kind of love in your relationships with each other, including romantic relationships, including marriage. You are to submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. In other words, the submission, guys, get ready, is mutual. This is why Christian marriage is a submission competition, because the command to submit is mutual. It is mutual submission. My friends, if you don't hear anything else today, this makes marriage amazing. This makes relationships amazing. This is what happy couples know. They know, I'm here for you, you're here for me, but I'm not here for you because you're here for me. I'm just here for you because God was here for me when I needed my Heavenly Father. I'm gonna leverage all of my resources, all of my talents, all of my gifts, I'm gonna leverage all of me for what benefits you the most. I'm telling you, in the first century, this was unbelievable. And Jesus is the model. So what Paul did is so brilliant. What came next had an effect on the audience that mimics or parallels our 21st century response to wives, submit to your husbands. So this is what he says to the men. Husbands, love your wives. Now, we're like, well, of course. But in the first century, it wasn't of course. In the first century, it's wait. I don't have an obligation to my woman. My woman has an obligation to me. The Apostle Paul says, I'm not finished. Husbands, love your wives just as, and this is the key, this is the connection, this is the link. These are the two words you should look for throughout the New Testament when you read the New Testament after the resurrection. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ, there it is, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, this is a Christian audience in Ephesus, and the guys are like, wait. I know this story. This does not end well for Christ. This does not end well for Jesus. Okay, I know where you're going with this. And Paul, we get the wives submit because, they kind of have to, but now you're telling us that we have a responsibility toward women. We have a responsibility toward our wives, that somehow you're inferring that there might even be a sense of equality. Where are you going with this? And the thing is, we know where this goes. Jesus died for the church. Paul's still not done. He says, look at this. He says, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. It's like he's saying, okay, if you can't get the theology thing about Jesus and the church, let me make it real simple for you guys. You are to love your wife. You are responsible to care for your wife. You are responsible to protect your wife as if she is you. This was just more than they could imagine. And he says this, He who loves his wife loves himself. Well, Paul, what are you talking about? Paul says, because there's a mystery. There's a mystery that when two people are married, they become one flesh. So there's no division. There's no pulling away. They're one flesh. Men, your wives are one with you. I'm telling you, as many times as you've heard this, and as strange as it may be, and as biblical as it may be, this was brand new because he was equating men with women. This was scandalous. That's why I said this. What comes next is why what came first is so offensive to us. The reason this is so great, and if you're not a Christian or you've left Christianity or used to be a Christian, I'm sure you have good reasons. In fact, I'm really sure you have good reasons, but I want you to hear this because this is so powerful. This is so powerful. The reason that we kind of bristle, and that women, you bristle when you wives submit to your husbands, is because our culture, our American culture, our Western culture embraces the equality of men and women. We embrace the equality of men and women. So the minute we hear somebody's supposed to submit to somebody else, that's like, but ladies, here's the amazing news. Guess who introduced this idea of equality to the world? Guess who rolled this out in such a big way that it actually made a big difference in culture? Guess who was the first person with any authority that declared you equal with men? Jesus. I'm telling you, I know this is naive. I think every woman should be a Jesus follower if for no other reason but this, okay? He argued for your value. He argued for your worth. He argued for your dignity before it was a category for anybody else in the world. And the Apostle Paul comes along and says, men, because of the way your Heavenly Father views the women in your life, you are to treat them with extraordinary, extraordinary value. And so Jesus rolls this out. The Apostle Paul pumps it up, and he says, I know you weren't surprised when I said women are to submit to their husbands, but I'm telling you, men, women, in God's eyes, you are equally valued and you are to submit to one another. This was life-changing. But our society, don't be deceived, our society that values men and women, that's not natural. There are other places in the world where women are still treated the way they were in the first century. You know that. It's not natural. This is a shadow, it's a shade, it's a leftover of the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of Paul as it relates to women. So back to Paul. What's his point? His point is men. Let me ask you a question. What is life to you? So we're back to the men. Men, what is life to you? Okay, I don't know. Just think, what is, I don't have a life. Yeah, you do. Okay, men, what is life to you? Here's his point. Just put her before that. Whatever life is to you, put her before that. And you can't do that as long as you've got a big box of expectations between you and her. And ladies, he would say, you can't love your husband as you're trying to mutually submit to each other as long as you've got a big box of expectations sitting between you. And this is what great, happy couples know, that somehow they get rid of this and they become all for the other person. So here's the question. How do you get everything out of the expectation box back into the hopes, dreams, and desires and dreams box? And then what do you do with it once you get it here? And the answer to the first question, in terms of how you get everything, from here back to here, is you decide, as we said last week, that he doesn't owe me anything. She doesn't owe me anything. And for this to work, and here's the key, this is what's going to frustrate so many of you, I understand, it has to be mutual. Why? Because he said, this is so powerful. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. This is what oneness in a relationship looks like. His best over yours. Her best over yours. Now, last week I gave you a little homework assignment, but it was a thought process. I asked you 2 questions. I said, this week I want you to think about what's in your box, and then I want you to think about, is somebody carrying it around? And so your homework assignment this week is this, and this is a little more dangerous, okay? I want you to ask them, what's in your box? What's in your box? Not on the way home. You got to wait for the right time. I just want you to ask him. I just want you to say, what's in your box? And then the next thing I want you to do, and this is going to be really difficult for some of you. After you ask what's in your box, then I want you to stop talking and listen. Now, guys, if you ask your woman, your wife, your fiance, what's in your box, she may faint that you've even asked or considered. She may get mad. We've been married 20 years and you still don't. Okay, that you just don't talk. You just take it because, you've been married 20 years and you don't know what's in her box because you've been wondering why she doesn't deal out of your box. Okay, there may be, some distance. So you just ask and you listen. And ladies, if you ask your man, your husband, your fiance, what's in your box, I tell you what he's going to say. Probably he's going to say, nothing. Nothing. Aren't the Falcons on? We don't even know we have a box. We're not lying. We don't know. We don't know what's in there. Now, we expect you to fulfill these wishes and dreams and desires that we've never defined. But ladies, I'm stereotyping a little bit, but there's a kind of I don't know how to talk about this. And ladies, here's the other thing about many of us men. And we're scared to talk about it. And men, the reason you need to talk about it is you're scared to talk about it, but you're expecting her to fulfill it, and you've never told her. And it's scary. In fact, it's terrorizing in some ways. But you talk about it. This is, the what's in your box question. This is the I'm all in question. This is the I am more interested in what's in your box than what's in mine. This is the I'm all in. I'm all into this relationship so much. I want to know what your hopes and your dreams and your desires. This is the I'm all in. This is the less self question. And you know something about less self people? Less self people are happier people. Find the happiest people you know, less self. And less self relationships are the richest and the richer relationships. Now, I know, if you're paying attention to this in your mind, you're going, yeah, but what about, and you're arguing. I get that. I would do the same thing. So I know for some of you, there's like, wait. I have one really, really big objection if I'm going to move forward with this, okay? Okay, Andy, if I take the pressure off, you have no idea what he's going to do. If I take the pressure off, you have no idea how much money she's going to spend. If I take the pressure off, he'll never come home from work. He'll just live there, okay? If I take the pressure off, he'll never follow through. She'll never follow through. If I take the pressure off, I'm your what? I'm afraid. I'm afraid she won't. I'm afraid he will. I'm afraid he'll start. I'm afraid she'll stop. But my friends, This is the way forward. This is the way forward. And if your relationship has boiled down to something simply being a tug of war, I mean, if your relationship is all about arguing over the box and you're on one side and he's on the other or she's on the other, if your whole relationship has come down to basically, you know, if I pull too hard, he won't pull hard. And if I don't pull, if it goes back and forth, if your whole relationship comes down to this, and the thought of laying down your side of the rope is terrifying, I understand that. I know how this works, okay? It's like, okay, honey, you heard what we said about the rope. So, okay, I'm gonna count to 3. We're gonna drop it at the same time, right? Because if I'm afraid, if I let pressure off first, this is just going in your direction. We're gonna be living in your box. And we'll just be all about you. So when I count to 3 now, listen, there's no hope till you let go of the rope. There's not. And because you're a Christian, if you're a Christian, you have to go first. And I'll tell you why. Because when you were dead in your trespasses and your sin, God, through Christ, dropped his end of the rope. Look, he did something for you, whether or not you ever did anything in response to what he did for you. That is the gospel. This is why all New Testament post-resurrection imperatives and commands in the New Testament all tie back into as God through Christ did for you. So, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. At the cross, God went first. Jesus followers go first. Happy couples put each other first by going first in an effort to be last. That Jesus followers, they put each other first by dropping that rope first in an effort to be last.